Start the. Okay, welcome everyone to our most recent episode of the Seleukid Lecture Series, which has been going on now for a couple of years, very happily. And one of the wonderful aspects of it is we have all sorts of guests of all sorts of stripes with all sorts of interests, and it's been a wonderful and collegial experience. Today, we're very lucky to have Elijah Vieira-Faria, who received his undergraduate degree in ancient history from the University of Swansea in 2018. He then went on to complete his master's in antiquities, classics, and ancient history and Egyptology at the University of Birmingham in 2019. But he loves Wales. He loves Wales because of its famously sunny weather. And so he wanted to go back. By the way, it's also wonderful for all those sheep. I loved all those sheep. So he's now returned to Swansea to conduct his PhD in ancient history, which he started in 2020. On behalf of Altay and myself, we welcome Elijah, and Altay will be introducing Eva as the respondent later. The title of this lecture is Contempt, Etched in Metal, Numismatic Evidence and Resistance to Seleucid Imperialism. Welcome, Elijah.
Thank you very much for having me, Ben. I suppose I should probably get the slides up and
Right.
get this show on the road.
Good.
Right, well.
Do it as the slideshow.
Yep. Well,
Here.
Again, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time out of your day to be here today. I appreciate it's very late for some, very early for others, or the middle of the day for quite a few of us. So thank you so much for coming, and hopefully this will mark a nice finishing point for the year for everyone, and we can all go and enjoy a nice peaceful break for a couple of weeks before the eternal grind starts again. But I suppose holiday well wishes and thank yous out of the way, I should probably get started. So, for me, Seleucid numismatic evidence represents the largest and most chronologically consistent evidence base available for studying the Seleucid Empire. From its formative years under Seleucus I and Antiochus I to later less attested to monarchs such as Antiochus X, the empire's regional chronology is well attested to in its numismatic evidence. Yet, despite the volume and continuity of this evidence, Seleucid numismatics remains occasionally something of an underutilized field. Whilst catalogues such as Newell's 1941 The Coinage of Western Seleucid Mints from Seleucus I to Antiochus III provide an abundance of reference material, or articles and monographs such as those produced by Lorber, Houghton, Jacobson, Erickson provide interesting and informative analysis of specific themes or issues of coinage, their focus is more often centered on macro-level topics. Ideology, politics, economics, and other such broader scale ideas are the questions which many of these works seek to address. Kemmers and Myburg suggested in 2011 that numismatists should do more than this. They rightfully identify that scholars often forget that coins are contemporary sources of evidence, which people directly interacted with, and as such, they can and should be treated with this information in mind. And this is because doing so will enable us to use our numismatic evidence in ways beyond themes such as political ideology or assessment of economic strength and weakness. For example, reconsidering our approach to defacing cuts to coins not only affords us an opportunity to discuss examples of political unrest, but also examining coins from a different perspective potentially affords scholars an opportunity to interact with and explore the motivation or cultural background behind such damage. And this is especially valuable when we consider the changes which have occurred in the past 20 or so years in relation to the study of empire. In recent years, the study of empire has shifted away from the macro level topics that I brought up earlier, such as war, politics, economics, and other such factors, and it has instead begun to explore the responses and actions of those who lived under imperial power. As Liebman stressed in a 2011 essay on the experience of Spanish colonialism in North America, it is important to appreciate that indigenous or resident peoples in empires were not monolithic groups, but rather large groups of individual actors with agency of their own. Now, as I'm sure we all appreciate that, unfortunately for scholars of the Seleucid Empire, we're afforded very little evidence of the everyman from the empire. And this is where I think that Kemmers and Mayberg's reassessment of the treatment of numismatic evidence can offer us a small but valuable insight into the responses of individuals to Seleucid imperial authority. The deliberate damage done by individuals to Seleucid coinage represents one of the few methods by which we can attempt to study individual reactions to Seleucid imperialism, and thus attempt to develop our study of the empire along similar lines to those which have proven beneficial in other fields. The problem, however, is that test cuts and defacing cuts have not necessarily featured as prominently in Seleucid scholarship as they have in other fields. Whilst significant effort has gone into classifying the coins and identifying their iconography, minting authority, and other such factors, less attention has been paid to noting any damage or other physical irregularities in catalogue records. As such, there is no standardized method of determining the parameters of what constitutes a test cut, defacing cut, or simple accidental damage. Consequently, this paper has two aims. Firstly, I shall seek to establish working parameters for determining whether specific coins should be defined as test cut or defaced. And secondly, I shall demonstrate that defacement of coins can give an insight into how individuals responded to Seleucid imperial ideology. Ultimately, I seek to demonstrate that we can use intentional damage to coinage to explore potential ways in which the subjects peoples of the Seleucid Empire reacted against their monarch's imperial ideology. Before we get to that, though, the first thing I should stress is that both test cut and defaced coins are pieces of money which have been intentionally defaced. The difference lies in the purpose and intent of this defacement. According to Kiernan, test cut coins are created solely for an economic purpose. That is to say, checking the authenticity of a coin's value, checking for forgeries, and other such procedures. Defaced coins, however, are ones which have been intentionally scratched or cut with the intention of leaving marks which serve no purpose other than to damage the aesthetic of the coin. The exact motivation behind defacing damage to a coin can vary from individual to individual, as we shall discuss later in this paper. But for now, it's enough to know that test cuts serve an economic purpose where defacing ones do not. In fields outside of Hellenistic numismatics, scholars use a range of criterion identifiers for distinguishing between defacing and test cuts. Obviously, each scholar interprets and applies each rule slightly differently, depending on their field of specialization or interest of study. But most significant of these can be broken down into sort of 5 broader rules or categories. And the first is that, is there a reasonable alternative source for the damage, such as drops, wear and tear, etc., etc.? Now, whilst this step is mostly to show due diligence in the identification process to prevent early misidentification of a coin's damage, it is no less important than the others. It is often easy to forget that coins were practical, well-used objects in antiquity, so it is likely that some damaged artifacts are simply a byproduct of the wear and tear of life. Ruling this out immediately, therefore, reduces the chance for misidentification and helps to clarify the pool of artifacts from which we can work. And the second point is, does the cut reach an edge of the coin or is it centralized? Now, a cut at the edge of a coin would be much more practical and easy to make due to being able to leverage a knife or whatever tool that you're using much more efficiently. Whereas the centralized cut is much more difficult to execute due to the small size of coin, and again, the practicalities of being able to simply inflict the damage in the first place. So by this logic, centralized cuts would have been slightly more difficult to perform and thus more likely to indicate a defaced coin as opposed to an economically test cut one. Another consideration is the cut superficial? Deep cuts tend to allow for a more thorough visual inspection of a coin to check for debasement or for and again, other such irregularities. Thus, on the other hand, a shallower cut is more likely to be intended to disrupt the iconography of the coin. And then another rule would be, does the cut compromise any key distinguishing features of the portrait, e.g. the eyes, nose, or the mouth? This can also manifest itself in other ways, such as the cutting of necks or other gestures which could be used to symbolize the killing of an individual depicted, which is quite a common practice in other fields such as Byzantine numismatics. Damaging the iconography of the coin in such a manner may be indicative of discontent either with the individual or the regime that they represent. And then, does the cut infringe on the coin's iconography for no obvious gain? As a final rule. Not all defacing cuts damage key identifiers in the iconography, such as the nose or the eyes. Sometimes defacing cuts can be damage done to the iconography in general. This also accounts for the occasions where test cuts do infringe on the iconography of the coin. After all, whilst many test cuts do not interfere with the iconography of the coin, sometimes it would have simply been impossible for an individual to test cut a coin without causing some damage to the iconography. So this is to provide some leeway and a little bit of accommodation. But there is one very important aspect that I need to stress, and that is that whilst these criteria provide us with a working framework, it is imperative that we remember that any analysis under these criteria is constrained by the aspects which are subjective in their nature. What I consider a clear indicator of defacement may be interpreted simply as a test cut by another scholar. However, this framework does not necessarily aim to create consensus, but merely to establish the guidelines which underpin my approach, thus enabling replication or comparative work, if not consensus, with every conclusion that I draw. I would argue that this is something which may be developed in the future beyond just Seleucid numismatics, but for now it's enough that it provides us with a reasoned and logical system, or at least I would like to think so, which can be utilized. Now, with the methodology established and explained, it's time to explore some examples of defacement. Broadly speaking, in my overall thesis, I demonstrate that malicious, intentional defacement of Seleukid coinage can be broken down into two larger categories, non-targeted and targeted defacement. Here, for brevity's sake and the time constraints imposed on me, I will unfortunately only be able to focus exclusively on targeted defacement, though I would argue it is the more interesting of the two. And this form of intentional damage covers coins that were damaged in response to political or cultural motivations, or whether defacement can at least be seen to target relevant political or cultural messages. Damage which can be understood to target specific features of a coin indicates a desire to remove or change the iconography depicted on it on a given coin. In the case of Seleukid coinage, I shall demonstrate the existence of two different subcategories of targeted defacement: institutional and individual. Institutional defacement covers the damage done by an individual to symbols of the Seleucid state, such as diadems or Apollo on the omphalos. Individual damage, by contrast, represents deliberate damage done to the key identifying features of portraits such as the eyes or nose, specifically attacking the person of the ruler rather than the iconographical manifestations of kingship and authority. By examining these types of defacements with the use of relevant examples, and the appropriate application of political, historical, or social context, I shall demonstrate the viability of using Seleukid numismatics as examples of resistance against Seleucid imperialism. Now, perhaps the two best examples of institutional damage can be found targeting the king's diadem, which we will see in figures 1 to 3 in a couple of slides' time, and the defacing of Apollo on the omphalos, which we'll see in figure 4 in about 13 slides' time. These examples represent not only the opportunity to engage in discussion about the nature of defacement, but also the symbolic meaning of these iconographical motifs to the Seleucids, and more importantly, their subjects. Now, first we're going to focus on the diadem. And the reason for that is because whilst the diadem was a mainstay of Hellenistic iconography, the Seleucids could perhaps exploit it in a very unique manner. Appian and Arrian recount a tale in which Seleucus I, whilst serving as an army officer under Alexander the Great, rescued the king's diadem after it fell from his head and landed upon some reeds whilst taking a boat trip in Babylon. Seleucus, being the enterprising young henchman that he is, dives into the river and retrieves the diadem, but he has to wear it and carry it back to the boat atop his head. Which prophecy or divine dream, depending on the context and the account that you read, alleges that whoever wears the diadem next will become master of all of Asia. Now, as with similar tales, such as the alleged anchor-shaped birthmark on Seleucus I's thigh, or his subjugation of a wild bull with nothing but his own raw strength and bare hands, there is little doubt that the story is a fictional creation. But whilst fictitious, and whilst the story could have originated outside of the control of the Seleucid court, if it was in circulation during the formative years of the empire, it may have given the numismatic depictions of the diadem a greater resonance. In any case, as was true across the Hellenistic world, the diadem became a key marker of royalty for the Seleucids and was ever present on their coin portraiture. And we can see that in the next couple of examples of here. So there's an example from the reign of Antiochus I, Antiochus II, and Seleucus III. And it is this connection which I would suggest is targeted in figure 1, which we have here, with the little cut coming through here. So the importance of the diadem then carried on into Seleucid iconography. However, whilst the earliest monarchs such as Seleucus and Antiochus I used the diadem to legitimize their kingship by using its ties to Alexander the Great, the role of the diadem in Seleucid iconography would have also changed as time went on. By the time of later monarchs such as Seleucus III, the association with Alexander the Great would have been of less importance. Residents of the Seleucid Empire would have been many years removed from the death of the all-conquering Macedonian king, and the diadem would have become one of the dynasty's symbols of imperial authority and legitimacy, just as it had become elsewhere in the Hellenistic world. Under the Achaemenid Empire as well, to provide perhaps a little bit of additional cultural context, the diadem was a symbol of nobility and a staple of attire, with expensive ones even potentially having being given out by the Achaemenid kings to their most loyal and successful courtiers as tokens of their favour with the king. As such, the adoption of the diadem by the Seleucid dynasty would have likely made for an easily understandable and interpretable piece of iconography to the people of the various cultures living under Seleucid rule. Now, the next two examples from amongst those found during my research, figures 2 and 3, come from the reigns of Antiochus IV and Antiochus VII respectively, and they demonstrate that defacement was still being employed during the later years of the Seleucid Empire as well. Figure 2 and figure 3. Cutting straight through again. Now, as we can see on those last two examples, and indeed in our first example, the most defining cut made into the metal of the coin is on the obverse and focused on the diadem being depicted on the king's head. And as we have already assessed, the diadem is not representative of the individual monarch, but the legitimacy of the Seleucid dynasty as a whole. It is the iconographical embodiment of Seleucid imperialism. Consequently, any attack against this symbol may be interpreted as not only an attack on the legitimacy of the king wearing it, but it could also represent a fundamental rejection of the institution which it represents. I would argue that based upon the relative framework I established earlier in this paper, that it is reasonable to argue that these cuts were made with the specific intent of defacing a key symbol of Seleucid iconography, as there is no need for these cuts to infringe upon the diadem to serve an economic purpose. But one could also question the effectiveness of such a gesture. After all, It is very specific and relies upon an individual having an awareness of the importance of the diadem. However, Plutarch's comparison of Cimon and Lucullus and Lucian's The Ship or the Wishes indicates that such awareness did in fact exist, even amongst individuals who did not place such cultural significance on the diadem. For example, Plutarch mentions that Tigranes was quick to remove his diadem and place it to the feet of Pompey as a show of deference. In doing so, he literally placed the representation of a kingship at the mercy of another, symbolically handing over those powers. Similarly, Lucian Psamippus states that upon killing the previous king, he cut off his head and stripped him of his diadem, and now I am the great king. Again, emphasizing the importance of the diadem as a physical manifestation of the king's power and authority as an individual by associating the right of kingship with the diadem itself, and not the family which it belonged or formerly belonged to. In both works, the diadem is literally and figuratively depicted as the physical and iconographical manifestation of a king's legitimacy, power, and authority. It is important to note that as much as the diadem can be associated with dynastic authority, it was also a symbol of an individual's right to rule. But even though the diadem could be considered a personal marker of authority, I would argue that our previous sources demonstrate that this particular piece of royal finery carried significance to those familiar with Hellenistic era culture beyond the display of the material wealth of the king, despite some works, like those of Arrian, Lucian, and Plutarch, being written well after the dissolution of the Seleucid Empire. This importance would have not been lost on contemporary individuals who lived under the Seleucids, and as such they would more than likely have been at least aware of the importance of the diadem, if not intimately familiar with every single aspect of its symbolism. By cutting through this key symbol of the dynasty's prestige and authority, these individuals, whoever they were expressing a rejection of the Seleucids' claims to royal authority, and thus their right to the title of Basileus. Diadems, however, were not the only symbols of Seleucid imperial authority which disgruntled denizens of the empire could deface to express their discontent or outright refusal of Seleucid imperialism. The next coin which I shall discuss is one from the reign of Antiochus III, which has been defaced on the reverse. Now, the defacement to the iconography here is centered around the figure of Apollo and Omphalos, a well-known Hellenic iconographical tradition used on Seleucid coinage. In figure 4, we can see a sharp angled cut completely removing the head of Apollo. I would argue that the depth and placement on the edge of the coin might allow one to interpret this as a test cut under my own rules. However, I would also suggest that this is actually unlikely because the placement of the cut removes the head of Apollo when there's still plenty of room for the cut elsewhere on the coin, which would not infringe upon this key aspect of Seleucid iconography. The conscious decision by the individual who cut this coin to attack the head of Apollo indicates a clear desire to remove it from the iconography, and therefore deface the coin. But why target this iconographical tradition in particular? The answer, I would suggest, is dependent on cultural context. Now, the first potential interpretation is that this was a Greek or Macedonian individual who, or somebody well versed in these traditions, rejecting the Seleucids' claims to divine lineage. In the same mold as Alexander the Great, who allegedly claimed to be the son of Zeus Ammon, the successor kings sought to elevate themselves above their subject peoples by laying claim to divine ancestry. Antiochus I pushed the rumour that his father, Seleucus I, was not in fact the son of a mere human, but the son of Apollo. This claim would have provided great legitimacy to the Seleucid royal family amongst those who understood the importance of Apollo amongst Olympian gods, and thus the importance of this specific connection. By cutting away Apollo's head, the defacer is attempting to remove the divinity of Apollo from the coin. And in doing so, they are rejecting the Seleucids' connection with their god, and thus rejecting one of the cornerstones of their claims to legitimate kingship. In this manner, they were possibly attacking the dynasty's progenitor to express their fundamental rejection of Seleucid control. However, as I stated earlier, it is important that we remember that iconography of Seleucid coinage didn't have a singular audience. Whilst the Hellenic subjects of the Seleucids would have understood the iconography of Apollo on Omphalos, their non-Hellenic subjects of the Seleucids may have had an entirely different interpretation of the damage that has been done to this coin. Now, in Near Eastern cultures in antiquity, archery was an important symbol of legitimacy for a king. Archery was viewed as a key indicator of a king's martial competence and skill, key attributes for a monarch of the time period. And a perfect example of this importance to Near Eastern kingship can be seen in the iconographical tradition of the Seleucids' Achaemenid predecessors. In Achaemenid iconography, bows and arrows, or the act of archery, were often featured in depictions which featured the king, as it was viewed, alongside chariot riding, as one of the chief martial skills of any good king. It helped to show a diverse and well-rounded skill set, which ensured that the king was always being depicted as the most able-bodied individual for the task of ruling the empire. And we can see examples of this iconographical tradition in Achaemenid cylindrical seals and numismatics, such as figures 5 and 6, as I shall show now. So here we have a golden daric, and we have a depiction of the king kneeling with his bow in one hand and an arrow in the other. And then figure 6, again, Achaemenid cylindrical seal, which depicts the king on the back of a chariot. Once again, bow and arrow drawn, ready to fire. Now, recent scholarship has suggested that the Seleucids may have sought to synchronize certain aspects of their iconography and ideology with local customs to enhance the legitimacy of their dynasty to their non-Hellenic subjects. As we have already established, archery is a defining iconographical tradition associated with kingship in several Near Eastern cultures. The use of Apollo on the reverse of Seleucid numismatics lends strong credence to these ideas. As noted by Erickson, the Seleucids may have deliberately leaned into their supposed connection to Apollo not only to legitimize their rule to their Hellenic subjects, but also to legitimize their rule to their non-Hellenic subjects by selecting a deity who was closely associated with a skill that was, in turn, very closely associated to legitimate kingship by Near Eastern cultures at the time. Thus, in a non-Hellenic context, the defacement of Apollo may be interpreted as an act of personal defacement against the king and not the dynasty as a whole. Irrespective of the cultural motivation behind this damage, I would argue that by attacking either a dynastic symbol or a depiction of the king, the individual who defaced these coins was expressing their discontent with Seleucid authority in a personal and very singular fashion. But the defacement of Seleucid iconography was not the only way individuals could express their discontent with the monarchy. They could also choose to deface the physical features of the portraits found on Seleucid coinage. Attacking symbols of the monarchy represented a way in which individuals could reject the idea of Seleucid imperial authority. However, by attacking the physical features of the portraits or individuals depicted on Seleucid coinage, an individual could express rejection of an individual's right to rule rather than the dynasty's overall authority. Whilst the two are obviously linked, there are clear distinctions between individual and institution when it comes to monarchy. And this distinction can be seen in the manifestation of individual rejection which we see on Seleucid numismatic evidence. We can see this in our next two examples, figure 7 from the reign of Antiochus III and figure 8 from the reign of Alexander II. So, not quite 100% sure how clear that one can always be, but it's coming through here through the nose and the eyes and down through into the cheek. And then in figure 8, a little bit more clear, with the coin of Alexander II, nice clear one coming through the nose and down into the eyes again. Now, what is most striking about the damage done in these two instances is that it is centralized heavily around the nose and the eyes. In either case, the nose and or eyes are cut through in quite an invasive manner. Now, whilst there is an argument to be made that this damage could be economic, their focus around these key identifying traits of a portrait, coupled with the shallowness of the cuts, is far more indicative, I would suggest, of these cuts being defacing in nature rather than economic. And when we pair this argument with wider cultural appreciation of crime and punishment, I would suggest that it becomes even more compelling. For example, blinding in ancient Greece was a punishment which was closely associated with the divine. From Oedipus's self-fulfilling divine prophecy to Stesichorus's alleged temporary blindness for insulting Helen of Troy, which he was only cured from after he wrote the famous beauty, a much more complimentary verse than his first attempt, the consistent appearance of the punishment is noteworthy. Indeed, if Plutarch can be relied upon to recount a myth that was in circulation at the time, and not a product of his skills as a writer, and a very talented one at that, the subjects of the Seleucids may have had an even closer example to draw from, in the form of Philip II of Macedon, who was allegedly rendered blind in one eye after using it to spy on Zeus, sleeping with Olympias, Philip's wife and Alexander the Great's mother, in yet another one of Zeus's endless pursuits of beautiful mortal women. Now, whilst the historical truth of these stories may be, we shall say, questionable, to be kind, these tales do show us that blinding as a divine punishment is an association which runs quite deeply through long periods of Greek history. But what's interesting is that blinding as a form of punishment was also deeply ingrained into Near Eastern cultures which the Seleucids ruled over, which was mostly a result of the influence of their predecessors, the Achaemenids. According to Herodotus, the Persian judge Sisomenes may have been blinded in one eye before being flayed alive after being bribed to rule unjustly on a trial. And furthermore, executions were not a quiet or clean affair in the Persian Empire. They were rather public and often quite messy, as emphasized by Darius I in the Byzantine inscription. And in this very long document, the King of Kings recounts in detail how the rebel Trichetimes was handled. Ooh, skipped over it. In his document, he recounts that thereupon Takasapad went forth with the army, and he fought a battle with Trichetimes. Ahura Mazda brought me help. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, my army utterly defeated that rebel host, and they seized Trichetimes and brought him unto me. Afterwards, I cut off both his nose and ears, and put out one eye, and he was kept bound at my palace entrance. All the people saw him. Afterwards, I crucified him in Arbela. Now, whilst it's not mentioned in the inscription, it is also likely that in a similar vein to much later execution practices, the charges and punishments against Trichetimes were read out, both at his display at Darius I's palace and again during his crucifixion in Arbela, as part of a process to ensure that those who saw what was happening understood what the punishment was for, even if they didn't know every single specific detail again. And blinding was often performed as part of a list of even more cruel and torturous affairs, such as being flayed alive or having the nose and ears cut off. And much like in Hellenic culture, the reasoning behind the punishment seems to have been relatively common knowledge, common enough at least that the significance of the mutilating of the image in the king in this way could be understood. But the logic behind the application of this damage to Seleucid portraits is also grounded within the empire's own contemporary practices, particularly in relation to illegitimate usurpers. Mutilation as a form of punishment for crimes for such a crime is carried over from the Achaemenid Persian Empire to the Seleucids, as seen in the case of the rebel satrap Molon. After being surrounded by the troops of Antiochus III in battle, Polybius tells us that Molon committed suicide after reflecting on the tortures which would be inflicted upon him if he were taken alive. Now, whilst Molon was able to spare himself the humiliation of suffering such mutilation whilst he was still alive, his body was still mutilated post-mortem and then impaled at Chaliontis, the most conspicuous place in Media. Now, this brutal, uncompromising punishment closely resembles the ruthless punishment described by Darius in the Byzantine inscription. And the existence of this precedent in both Seleucid Empire's predecessors and the empire itself, coupled with contemporary knowledge, lends great support to the argument that the defacing cuts to figures 7 and 8 were made to refute the legitimacy of the king depicted on them. And consequently, I would argue that the cuts through the eyes of these two coins are symbolic attempts to recreate the punishment used by the Seleucids and their predecessors to punish those who would become rebels or attempt to usurp the throne. It is interesting that the kings depicted in figures 7 and 8 ruled during very heavily contested reigns. Alexander VII, in figure 8, is thought to have had absolutely no legitimate claim to the Seleucid crown at all, as his parentage could never be clarified or even proven. Meanwhile, as we have already noted, Antiochus III, in figure 7, faced significant opposition to his reign in the form of the usurpers, or rebels, Molon and Achaeus, whom Antiochus spent most of his formative years as king combating. In both instances, the individual depicted on the obverse portrait of the figures presided over reigns where their right to rule was directly challenged. These challengers would have had supporters, and it would make sense that they viewed Antiochus or Alexander as being illegitimate kings, and wanted to persuade others that this was the case. This would account for at least one group of individuals who may have expressed this through the mutilation of their coinage using established punishment for illegitimate claimants to royal authority. Now, I would not suggest that one of Molon's supporters made the cuts to figure 7 or that one of Alexander II's many detractors defaced figure 8, as this would be far too speculative. The point is simply that it is not unreasonable to interpret these cuts through the eyes of figures 7 and 8 as an expression of belief in the illegitimacy of the monarch that they depicted. Now, as I sort of wind things down here, it is interesting to note that the work which this paper has undertaken does, in part, potentially mimic the thoughts of the individuals who handled these coins after they had been defaced. Much in the same way I have been left with the task of discerning the potential reasons for the damage done to a coin, so too would the individuals who handled these coins after their previous owners had defaced them have had questions of their own. Questions which would generate answers based on their own knowledge, understanding, and experiences. And it is the importance of knowledge, presentation, and interpretation which often dominates discussions about reactions to imperial power. With this paper, I would suggest that if we have taken but one small step on a long road to improving our understanding of how individuals in the Seleucid Empire reacted to imperialism. The reason I say one step is because ultimately there is no way for us to definitively prove why any of these coins in this paper were defaced. The intent of the individuals for whom our only record of existence is a single scratch etched into but a single coin is realistically lost to us forever. However, this discussion has demonstrated that established cultural and historical precedents can help us create well-reasoned and plausible motivations for these cuts. Furthermore, this discussion, I would suggest, has shown that each act of defacement could have been perceived differently to its intent by individuals, depending on their cultural background. In doing so, I would suggest I have demonstrated a new way in which we may approach the discussion of Seleucid numismatic evidence. By moving beyond the economic and political discussions which have typically dominated previous scholarly orthodoxy, I would argue I've not only demonstrated the value of discussing the damage done to coinage within a wider cultural and historical context, I have also shown the potential value of numismatic evidence as a means by which we can engage with individual acts of resistance against the rule of the Seleucid dynasty. Thank you very much for listening. I guess I'm turning over to Altay now.
Thank you so much, Elijah, for gifting us with this really stimulating and original research presentation towards the end of this year's lecture series. That was really great, and I think it resonates with many of us, even though I've never thought about this physical aspect of coinage. After having published Seleucid Ideology with a focus on reception of ideology, together with my friend Richard Wenghofer earlier this year, I really am very much interested in all kinds of questions that deal with the reception of royal claims to superiority, to rule, and what was made out of it in the hands of the subjects, most literally. So that is a very stimulating new pathway you have opened up for us, and thanks for this last real highlight in our lecture series this year. But it's not yet the end of this lecture series, because we can still look forward to having a wonderful discussion. And in this, we will be assisted by my dear friend and our colleague, Dr. Eva Anagnostou-Laoutides, who is associate professor at Macquarie University in Sydney. And once again, she is bringing a sacrifice for us. It's in the middle of the night, but she values us so much that she, sacrifices some of her sleep. Well, Eva is clearly a model of a colleague, but also a model of a scholar and of a lifelong learner. It's very difficult to pick out of her rich biography to introduce her a little more, if that were necessary, because most Seleucid scholars, and especially most who attend this caucus or this lecture series regularly, know her quite well. But with her book In the Garden of the Gods, kingship models from, I think, the Sumerians to the Seleucids, she positioned herself quite in the center of the study of Seleucid royal ideology, and she added strongly to this with the co-edited volume on Seleucid ideology and culture, which was published in 2022. She has so many more publications, and I just mentioned that they cover topics from Platonic reception down into the Middle Ages, Greek mythology also, particularly in their reception, in their Christian reception, and much more. I'm also excited to see in her CV that the stages of her career really characterize her as a scholar, as the traveling scholar of old. For every new degree, another city and sometimes a new country or even continent, starting in Thessaloniki with her BA in the earlier 1990s, followed by an MA degree, I think, in Leeds, UK, and then a PhD in University of Canterbury. And then she did not stop, but so eager in learning, she added another MA degree at Macquarie University. And that's not yet the end point. Then I count so many more language certificates where she really addressed one of the Near Eastern languages after the other. So truly a model of learning and an inspiration to us, Eva. But that's not actually the reason why I asked you for your help today, because you wear so many different hats, and the hat you are wearing today is that you are also the deputy director or president of the Australian Centre for Numismatic Research. I think I More or less, it has the same meaning. ACANS is the acronym, but that shows how much your diverse expertise is valued wherever you go, and we're so glad to have you with us, Eva.
Altay, you'll make me blush in the middle of the night. First of all, with your compliment. Second, you've made such an effort to memorize all these places I've been to. It's a great pleasure to be here. Indeed, I value this forum very, very much. Most of all, because we can all come even less prepared at times and just throw ideas in a very collegial and friendly environment. That's really important. And that was my experience when I presented here a year ago or so, before I was even the involved in ACANS, the Australian Centre for Ancient Numismatic Studies. Thank you very much, Elijah, as well, for presenting us with this very refreshing, very different perspective on coinage. Just as Altay said, I hadn't thought much of coinage mutilation, although I have to say, in preparation for the paper that I published with your volume and Richard's volume, Altay, last year, Catherine Lorber, who's here, I can see, was very kind to alert me to anchor erasures on Seleukid coinage, though that was erasure from coin dies, so slightly different to what you were talking to us today. In my response, I'd like to point out, first of all, bring to your attention some bibliography, and then point out areas where I think you could strengthen your argument. Please do not take my comments as criticism. It's precisely because I was really, really intrigued and interested in what you were presenting us with. Like all PhD students, I remember myself, even it was pretty, a few years ago now, we all want to make a claim that, what we're doing is groundbreaking. Pay attention to my project. It's really new. Your project is so new that you really don't need to emphasize it all that much, especially as there has been a number of recent publications that do try to bring in coinage perspectives and the lives of people during the Hellenistic period. From a brief bibliographical search, I could come across Neumann, Counting Change, that is 2021. I could see Thoneman, The Hellenistic World Using Coins as Sources, 2016. Now, all of these do not, there are more that I will send you afterwards, but all of these indicate that increasingly coinage is taken seriously as a valuable resource for figuring out not only the reception of imperial ideology, but also what coins have to say about people's everyday life. They don't say much about mutilation of coinage or defacement, which is exactly where you can come in and throw more light and give us your insights. I liked your discussion of Liebman 2011, but when it comes to cultural tensions that you've mentioned a number of times in your paper, I'd like to see a bit of more of a theoretical model. And I thought that maybe you should have consulted Stavrianopoulos' 2013 volume on shifting social imaginaries. You did discuss on a number of occasions, well, we don't know, are these mutilations really by Greek people who don't like the king for some reason, or don't buy the idea of divinity, the divinity of the king, or is it by the locals? We know they're individuals. We know we're not talking about collective resistance to Seleukid expansionist policies. I have to say, the philologist in me cringes when I see imperialism used for the Hellenistic period.
That's fair. I still cringe a little bit when I use it as well.
And I noticed Altay as well kind of avoided it. I think you talked about superiority, legitimacy, but imperialism was
Yeah.
But you know, I very much liked your breaking down of the phenomenon of defacement, that you know, we need to talk about the institution versus particular rulers. You left me with a lot of questions. I'm sure the other people in the audience have questions as well, such as, where were these coins found? Do we know anything about the last person that used them? Were they part of a hoard? Were they found near a mint, for example? Could some of the damage be because the artist was not satisfied with the head of Apollo, for example? Other than that, I think the arguments you put forward were really strong. I was more convinced with the second part of the paper when you discussed defacing the man. I could see the sources. You engaged all of the sources in a compelling way. I wanted a little bit more about the diadem.
Okay.
And what about, I think Kyle Erickson discussed the particular winged diadems of, was it Antiochus II and Antiochus Hierax? That was in a 2018 Classical Quarterly article. So when you want to discuss people's possible reaction to the diadem as a symbol of royalty and, importantly, of divinity, of the divinity of the king, then why don't you talk us through a little bit more about what it meant, particularly for the Persians, because that's where Alexander picked up the diadem. So in many ways, the Seleucids present themselves as legitimate successors of Alexander by adopting the diadem. So could it be someone who just didn't accept their legitimacy?
Could be. It's a very difficult it's a very difficult question to answer, because it's obviously, you have to be trying to factor in the level of understanding that the individual would have in relation to the diadem, because obviously I'm going to be honest, it's a line of questioning that I have thought about to an extent, but I'm not pushed as much, perhaps, particularly with this paper, as I could have. In my thesis, I probably, particularly in relation to the diadem, I perhaps address it a little bit more, because I have a little bit more time and room to sort of
Oh, don't take me wrong.
Oh no, I know, no. I'm just saying as a thing. So it's I'm as a point of consideration for the future. It's definitely something that I'll be looking to add into the word count, which I'm sure Stephen will be most joyed to read, an extra 5,000 or so words. But no, that's an excellent point, and one particularly in regards to the divinity aspect with the winged diadems I hadn't actually thought about so much. So I'm definitely going to be going away and doing some reading on that after this. So thank you very much.
Pleasure. I don't want to take up a lot of time from the other participants. The last thing I will say, when you try to argue that there may be a reaction to the institution versus a particular king, I think this question is really different when you suspect a non-Greek reacting to it. Because to a non-Greek, I don't think it would matter very much whether they react to the institution or a particular king. Maybe when we talk about Seleucus IV, yes, it's the particular king because you have a breakage in the relationship of certain communities with him. But to start with, why would someone react to Seleucus the First and not the dynasty altogether? Or his son and not the dynasty, if they were non-Greek? What would it matter to them?
Well, I mean, within a certain context, I suppose you can. The easiest card to play in response to that is the typical, I suppose, outsider versus local mentality. I suppose in a respect, you have. And with individuals as well, individuals might necessarily have problems with the king or something that has been done in that region. But again, it's a very, I suppose, again, another aspect less considered on my part. But it's one of those ones that's, again, I suppose, particularly within the numismatics, it's not a question that I would personally, at the moment at least, find too easy to answer. But I think. Trying to think of a way that I can potentially answer this.
No, I mean, you don't have. These are just things to
I know.
like,
I enjoy
little details like
I enjoy the mental exercise.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you don't like Apollo, why deface the face and not the bow?
I think in that context, it's because whilst the bow is obviously intrinsic to Apollo, I would suggest that there's perhaps something more potent in defacing the persons of a god as opposed to just the symbols of, that are most closely associated with them. It's one thing to deface the bow, it's another entirely to chop the head off of a deity. That's I would say that the escalation there in terms of the damage that's being done is quite significant, and it's a lot more impactful if you're defacing the individual themselves as opposed to just, again, a symbol of their of that divinity.
I think I'll bring my response to a conclusion. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you can take ideas from that. But I think it's time for the rest of the participants to have a chance. Thank you, Altay, for your invitation once more. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks so much, Eva and Elijah, for getting this discussion started for us. May I come back directly to the defacement of Apollo, because that was also one argument that I found a little less convincing, for the reason, if a Greek would typically have accepted the divinity of Apollo, and that would be quite blasphemous. I was wondering whether this was not rather the deed of an Easterner, perhaps a Persian or anyone else in the Near East, who thought, well, this guy is claiming to be our king, and he's not, and he should not be. So someone who did not actually know exactly how the Greek reading of this coin meant to be, but rather someone who recognized a human claiming to be the king, the legitimate king, and denying that by defacing the head. That was my spontaneous speculation, and indeed it is just a speculation, because I did not even know where the coin came from, whether it was found more in the east or closer to the Mediterranean coast. As Eva said, it is important to provide information about the find spots wherever available. We know it's not always available. That's a big obstacle for the kind of research that you are doing. So
yeah, it's one of the big problems with find spots, as I'm sure anyone who's worked with Seleukid numismatics is that in about 50% of the cases, the find spot will be given, it will say something to the effect of Syria, and then say, for example, you're using a resource like Seleucid Coins Online. The area that is given is then not just a quadrant of Syria, it is the entire region, and perhaps, stretching a little bit into Turkey and a couple of other places. So for most of the ones that I picked for today's discussion, off the top of my head, I believe the ones from just as a thing on the fine spots and hordes, I believe the ones from Antiochus III, II, and Seleucus III that were the one from Antiochus I and Antiochus IV, those two were found without a fine spot in Syria, just Syria, because that's very helpful information. I believe figure 4 was I believe that might have been off the top of my head again, because I've got to include this information because I'm very attentive and prepared. If memory serves me correctly, that one was it was somewhere in between Syria and Babylon. It sort of comes across in that region. So personally, when it comes to bring it on to the point of the divinity, I personally also tend to lean more towards the non-Greek line of thought, because it, as you said, in a Greek context, blasphemous, extremely about as big of a no-no as you could probably perform with the iconography of a deity. But I suppose in sort of defense of that, it's less about attacking the it's less about attacking Apollo as a deity and more as there are only a limited number of things that you can fit onto a coin in terms of iconographical motifs and information, because there's only so much space. And Apollo is so associated with the Seleucids that if your choices are on the obverse or the reverse, depending on the individual and how bold they're feeling, there is an argument to be made that they could consider it not necessarily an act against the god, but an act against the dynasty that's effectively misappropriating his divinity. And I believe it's in Kiernan's 2001 essay that was written for the British Museum. In a Roman context, there's a practice of removing symbols of divinity from coinage before they're offered up for sort of ritualistic purposes at temples and whatnot. And there's, I suppose, an argument to be made here that there's it's as much removing the divinity of Apollo from the coin as not as a slight against the god, but as a slight against the dynasty, and removing the context of the divinity by saying, no, you don't get to use Apollo as your divine progenitor. You're not legitimate. This is nonsense. And removing the head from that can effectively sort of work within that context. But like you, I am more inclined towards the Eastern argument, just because I think with that particular point it makes sense. But I did feel when I was writing the paper initially and doing my initial draft for the chapter for my thesis, that it would be a bit remiss of me not to at least explore the other potential connotation as well, even if I think, like you said, the second argument is perhaps the more compelling of the two.
Thank you. Well, let's open up the discussion. Who would like to go next? I'm sure there are many more questions, comments. Nicholas, please.
Just quick note in regard to the coin, would perhaps be interesting to look whether there are any examples of mutilations of divine figures on Greek coins, just in general. Whether one can find this just for classical Greece or from any of the other Hellenistic kingdoms. Now, I was actually more interested in the kind of defacement of the royal face, and you gave the example of the Persians, but I think you could go back further. So for Neo-Assyrian times, for example, there's a lot of examples of cutting off the nose, damaging the ears. There's the famous bust of Naram Sin in the British Museum, of course, which you should be familiar with, and also the concept of Bashtu. So this is kind of an Akkadian word for dignity. And when someone's Bashtu is harmed, it's often by cutting off the nose, cutting off the ears. So it fits quite well within Mesopotamian, wider Mesopotamian patterns and wider ancient Near Eastern patterns. So I would go far beyond just the Persian. Persians are also just working based on earlier motives, as the Seleucids later.
Oh no, absolutely. I do go a little bit further back in the full thesis, but as honestly, it is something that I probably should push a little bit more on. So thank you very much. That would be, I will certainly be pursuing that once the Christmas break is over. But it is, it's an avenue that I've lightly explored, but again, particularly in the confines of the paper, I couldn't bring everything in, but yeah, no, I'll definitely be pursuing it a lot more, because I do think you're right in that there's a lot wider and older context to be bringing in as well. So thank you.
Thank
you for the
you. And next
presentation.
comes Hordi.
Hello. Yes, thank you for the
Oh.
presentation. It's good to see you again, I guess. I don't think you remember me, but we studied together in Swansea, and good to see Stephen as well here again.
I do. Oh my goodness. How are we?
Yeah, so I had a couple of comments, because it's interesting that you divide what's it called? Test marks and God, my English. Test marks and the other type of marks, the what do you call them? Where you defacing.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much. So defacing mark and test mark, but I thought there could be a possibility where a test mark would be made intentionally to deface. Like there could be a context where both those things are true at the same time. It would be very interesting to, I mean, it's very much nearly impossible to distinguish between the two, and obviously you need a typology to separate these things, but it's always good to keep in mind that maybe someone who's doing a test mark is also unhappy with royal portraiture, royal aspects of kingship, or is supporting a different king. So maybe they do a test mark that just surreptitiously passes, a defacing mark that surreptitiously passes as a test mark as well. It could be, I don't know if you think that could be discernible among everything else as well.
It's, as I sort of said at the conclusion of the paper, reaching sort of like that a definitive answer of intent it's virtually impossible unless we have obviously a wider consideration and context. The reason why I would hesitate to sort of create, I suppose, a third subcategory is that whilst a cut could potentially, as you said, be, masquerading effectively as a test cut, with it, ultimately the intent of the individual, we'll say primary intent for the purposes of this, would, for me at least personally, constitute defacing. Because the intent is ultimately to cause damage that impedes that iconography and expresses discontent. The fact that it's them masquerading as a test cut, to get past local officials so you don't get arrested or whatever, for chopping off the king's nose or putting out his eyes, I would say that's sort of like the secondary consideration, which, whilst I think it makes for interesting discussion and theory, I would say that the defacing aspect kind of overrides it, because that's the primary intent, and I'm more interested in that primary intent than I am in the sort of like the I suppose the the cat and mouse games to avoid being caught by the local authorities. But it's definitely an interesting point, and something that whilst I'd say it's very difficult to really prove or push too far, it's definitely, at least within particularly for just sort of like theoretical and discussion, it's definitely a good point, and one that I'll consider moving forward.
Yeah, I don't know why, but I just tend to end up proposing arguments, or going back to reminding people that a lot of things in archaeology you can't really just, it's very much impossible to figure out whether it's one way or the other. The other comment is quite short, actually. I'm not familiar with epigraphy, and it's probably there where you would find it more likely to find it. But I'm currently wondering, and this is not just a question specifically at you, but if you have any information, it'd be perfect to answer. But I'm wondering whether, just like today, there are laws against defacing currency that were put in place in the ancient world as well. Considering that test marks and other such things do need to exist in order to prove the value of the coin. So I'm not sure.
So I'll speak, I suppose, from my experience quickly, is that there is an example from, I believe it's Athens, where there are specific rules, and sort of like there's a, I believe it's a stela that was put up that basically governs sort of like, this is how you will do a test cut. This is how, this is, the amount of metal you're allowed to remove. This is, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. And in later cultures and in later contexts, there are, like even in today's society, you can't do certain things to money without winding up in a fair bit of trouble. In terms of ancient laws, like I said, with Athens, that's the primary example that I can think of, because it's the one that I interacted with for quite a while. As for within a Seleucid or Persian context, I'm less certain. Just myself, but I do know that there are sort of like guidelines and rules that they exist, but how consistent those are and how consistently they're enforced throughout sort of like different societies in the ancient world, I wouldn't be able to comment with absolute certainty. So, but no, it's definitely something that I'll again sort of I suppose take into a little bit of extra consideration, and probably be adding 1,000 or so words for Stephen to be reading.
I'm really
PhD.
sorry, Stephen. But,
no, don't apologize.
Thank you very much.
Helping me. That's good.
Thank you. I think it's good to look for written sources, for legal sources in the broader context. And something that's quite late, but that's coming to my mind, is the Theodosian Code with imperial constitutions of the 4th century that do that have a lot of things to say and threaten the people against so many things that they must not do with the coinage. I do not remember specifically whether there is any interconnection with the name or even the portrait of the emperor that this would constitute an immediate connection of the imperial figure and the coin, which should not be tampered with. So that might be worthwhile looking at. But next comes Julian. Hallo Julian, hallo nach Bielefeld.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much for the presentation and also the feedback, which was very illuminating, both of it. I have 2 questions as well, just like Jordi, but one short question first, and I'm not entirely sure, since I'm not that familiar with Seleucid coins. I'm not sure how much sense it makes, because we were speaking about the find spots earlier, but can we find any kind of regional geographic patterns where we have a greater number or the greatest numbers of defaced or damaged coins? Is there any patterns we can see and of these coins where they've been found or minted, which could be related theoretically to any kind of regional unrest or whatever? And that would also lead to my second question. Obviously, since you were looking at the Seleucid Empire in the long term, we have all of these breakaway states from the 2nd century BC, or really from the 3rd, actually. I guess Antiochus III reigns in this a bit, but then, of course, after the war against the Romans, it starts again. So obviously, these states they changed imagery of the coins. I mean, they orient themselves on the Seleucids, but they also change it to their demands or their desire, their local desire. So I was just wondering if you're also looking into this and the relation between them and the Seleucid coinage, because you always have this double kind of relation, obviously, where the Seleucid coinage, as it is accepted, well, also since the days of Alexander, I guess, so the Seleucids themselves have this relation with Alexander's coinage. You take the familiar, so people will accept it, but you also try to introduce your own messages. Yeah, so that would just be, if you want to look at this at all, or are you just looking at Seleucid coinage within the Seleucid Empire minted by the kings and their agents, so to say? Yeah.
So, to answer the first question, it's incredibly difficult to do any sort of geographical assessment of it, mostly because part of the problem is just information recording. I'll call it spotty, to be polite, to be nice, for some of it. For some of it, it's very good, but then the problem becomes that so for example, there is a hoard that was found all the way in Belgrade, which had Seleucid coinage in it. And some of that Seleucid coinage came from the mint at Antioch, and some of it came from a bit further afield, more pushing towards the east of the empire. So the problem becomes that coinage, obviously by its nature, goes into circulation, and where things are found, and at what point along that road they are defaced, then becomes the problem as well. Because if we're assuming that the coinage is defaced and then enters the archaeological record to be found by us 2,000 years later, we're assuming that that's the last point of contact, when in a practical sense a lot of the coinage would have probably stayed in circulation for a little while longer. How much longer, you can't say for certain, but it would have probably stayed in circulation. Obviously there'll be exceptions to that, but it makes it very difficult to do that kind of assessment, just because we don't have the certainty, I would suggest, that's necessarily needed for it. As to the second question, I look at it a little bit more long form in the actual thesis, and part of actually a small part of it, which I believe my other supervisor, Maria, has both suggested is her favorite part and least favorite part of the chapter. There are a couple of examples of gold status from Bactria that are minted, and they have Antiochus II depicted on them, but they also it's sort of like beginning at the transitionary phase, from as Bactria decides that it doesn't particularly enjoy Seleukid oversight as much. But what's quite interesting about them is that there are actually indicators of local support for the Seleucids against a drive to sort of push away and disentangle from the empire, or at least I would suggest, because there are a couple of golden status that have been mutilated, which strongly resemble bull's horns, which are feature quite prominently on a lot of portraiture from the reign of Seleucus I, and a couple of examples from Antiochus I as well. Typically in depictions of Alexander the Great, there's and a couple of other iconographical traditions. There's these bullhorns, and yeah. So I've looked at it in one particular region. I haven't sort of looked at other regions from other time periods, and I think in part it's because the whole thesis doesn't focus solely on numismatics, so I had to be selective in the areas, regions, and the amount of information that I was processing. And Bactria had quite a lot, so I stuck with that one because it's a fairly generous region to work with in that regard. So yes, I have done it, not perhaps to the scale that I would like to. I might be able to squeeze a little bit more in, but at the same time, there's only so much that I can talk about in one chapter that I have to, unfortunately, be selective. But if I get the chance to pursue it going forward, I definitely will be, because it is definitely something worth considering. So thank you.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. And I think Bactria is a good example because they break away early, as you say. So it's good to focus on one example in your PhD because you also have space.
Yeah, exactly.
Problems. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Ben comes next.
Yes. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. A short bibliographical note. Rolf Strootman has a wonderful article in this book, Seleucid Perspectives 1, shameless plug, and about mutilation. And he mentions Molon at length and everything. And I think that would be a good resource for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, my bigger question really piggybacks on what some of the other ones have asked. Do you have a database?
Yes, I do. So for the sort of the first 3 months of working on this chapter for my doctorate, I was under the guidance of both Stephen and I was also pointed to the lovely Dr. George Watson at Swansea University, who at the time was our resident numismatist. And the first thing that I was told was that I would have to go through the pain and suffering of making a database, which I then spent about 2 to 3 months of putting together, which was right in the middle of COVID as well. So it was an extra fun challenge. So yes, that has been.
Okay, is that part of your thesis?
It is. In so much as I reference to it and draw material from it, and its inclusion is more as, I suppose, in the grand scheme of the discussion and everything that goes on within the thesis, it's as much a part of it as it is. It forms a lot of the backbone for the information that's presented, but discussion around it, I suppose, is limited to when it's necessary.
I guess what I'm asking is, I'm sort of longing to see that.
I will.
No. What I mean, let me explain that. I understand what you're saying about limitations and that coins go and everything like that. But the whole time that you were talking, I wanted to see a chart. I wanted to see where, and a number of people have asked questions, pertaining to this. And so, I mean, if I could see that, and I'm wondering if there wouldn't be conclusions that would come out organically from some of that data. And again, I think other people have been asking around this. I think that would be of value, even given all of your reservations and all the considerations. I think that certain things would just jump out from that.
No, I think you're right, and I suppose a part of the reason for some of the reservations is that 99% of the time when I was interacting and working with this database, it has always been what I can only quite frankly describe as an absolute monster of a spreadsheet. So I think, so I think you're absolutely right, and that's definitely something that I. Particularly with the graphs aspect, actually, as well, because I think that it would be a very fruitful thing to do, and it's definitely something that I will be going back and having a look at, because I think that you're right, that could be helpful.
If you've done all that work anyway, maybe somebody else comes along right? And can draw other kinds of conclusions from it. And you've done a great service to the field because you've produced that data, which we didn't have before.
No, absolutely. I think I'm actually in the process of going back through it and combing it to make sure that everything's 100% at the moment. So hopefully once that's all done and the PhD is done, that will be I suppose my gift to hopefully a gift to the academic community. So yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for bringing it up.
To round off that topic, can you give us a figure? So in absolute terms, what's the number of defaced coins that you've counted?
That's the kind of thing I was looking for. Yes.
All right. Okay. So, in terms of out of the 1,000 coins that I've entered into the database, give or take about 50, I think, either side. From that, I believe the total number of defaced was sitting at around 100 and it was 152 or 153, one of the two. There's one that I'm very iffy on that I'm to this day, 3 years later, I'm still sort of arguing with myself over. So of it, it's about 10-15% of the coins that I looked at. The rest account for accidental damage, economic, and so on and so forth. In terms of to put the numbers into a broader sort of, I suppose, context, I think in total I looked at around 15,000 examples, I think. So it's to situate it in sort of like it's not, I wouldn't suggest, just from numbers perspective as an additional comment, I wouldn't suggest that it is necessarily that a massively frequent practice or a common, it's not common in the same way that we would perhaps associate in other things based on those numbers. But then I would also add that total volume of coinage produced versus total volume of coinage that survives to us, that obviously skews how the numbers and the way that the information survives to us. So that's sort of where we're at with numbers in terms of what I have collected in my database. But obviously, given the difficulties and trials and tribulations of archaeology and just information surviving to us, the picture's obviously not anywhere, I wouldn't suggest complete, but that's to give sort of like an idea of where I'm at with that.
Thank you. That was very helpful. In fact, that's even more than I thought. Around 150 from around 15,000. That's a solid 1% more than I was expecting, especially when we consider the likelihood of being preserved or still being there. And because one would expect that damaged coins, for whatever purpose, would be more likely to be molten or restruck or overstruck or whatever than beautifully preserved coins. But that leads over to one other question that I'd like to raise. We've raised many questions, and basically that's also the purpose of this discussion, which in part is work in progress, to accompany you on that journey of exploration a little bit. You have started with some assumptions on the intentions of those who do damage to coins, whether it's testing or whether it's challenging the claim to royalty or divinity. What we have not yet discussed and just, perhaps implicitly alluded to is a very basic aspect of the context of coin usage. What would it mean for someone to pay with a coin that has the king defaced? What would it mean for someone to receive a coin with a defaced king? is it not potentially dangerous? Or is, in a different context, say, oh, there is a revolt going on, and a revolt that is very popular in a certain region, let's say Bactria or Persis, then you may even hope that the defaced coin will be popular. But if the king is firmly established and has large support from the local elites, it may be the opposite. So considering these things, well, this consideration may lead us into very different directions. The one direction is, well, what happened with the coin or with the appreciation of its depictions after the king's death, or even after the dynasty was either extinct or expelled from that territory. That's the one thing. The other thing is, even if you hated the king, would you consider doing that damage to the value of the coin, which you may no longer use for regular payment? So I would like to hear a little bit more about these very practical implications, which, however, are so closely intertwined with the ideological framework and the economic perspective as well.
So I think within a to deal with the economic aspect first, it's as Jordi actually said earlier, the whole context of whether or not it's defacing or if it's test cutting within a practical context. Test cutting in many ways is not devaluing of a coin's overall value. It's actually very helpful, because if a coin has been test cut and remains in circulation, it's a marker of confidence in the coin, I suppose, because it's been checked, it's been found to be acceptable for transactionary purposes by an individual. So payment, in terms of the economic side of things, I think it only becomes a concern if you're, I suppose, removing there are a couple of examples of coins which I found from the reign of Antiochus III, actually, where they'd had almost like a pizza slice of metal removed from them. And in those instances, it's removing a fairly significant chunk of weight from the coin, and there is an argument to be made that the actual value of the coin has been significantly decreased enough with that kind of damage that their economic value and their use economically has kind of been rendered moot, because they no longer hold the value that they're said to. With the sort of damage that we've typically seen, particularly sort of in the paper today, most of them aren't particularly invasive in terms of the level of damage done to the metal. So if you were paying with one of those, if someone just said, oh, it's been test cut, if someone questions why the king suddenly got a cut through his eyes and his nose, as Jordi said, there's a reasonable enough level, I suppose, of deniability there that it just passes off from an economic perspective, and you can effectively get away with it, and the coin stays in circulation because of, like I said, you're showing that the value of the coin is like what it says it is. So it's fine for transactionary purposes. As opposed to post-Seleukid, the consideration of the coinage in a post-Seleukid period, it's not really a question that I've actually considered all too much, if I'm all too honest. Mostly because obviously the focus and the research and the PhD has been centered around sort of like internal responses and sort of, I suppose, at the time within the empire. So for a post sort of like after the dynasty's gone extinct and the use and the value question, it's honestly not something I've actually explored. So it's definitely something I'll go away and I suppose be considering.
Thank you. And Eva?
I think that's where comparable examples could help you.
Mhm.
As Altay was talking, I kept thinking, I read in a draft sometime soon, after the Sasanian Empire, from the 750 onwards, all the way to the 10th century, you have a number of defaced Sasanian coins in circulation in India, in places like Rajasthan, like a lot of them.
Hmm.
So you kind of have to consider, surely the people knew what they were doing and they agreed the coins still have value, and they're still useful for our economy. But, clearly the regime has now changed, and that's what we have to do to go with the flow.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. I don't know how far back you can trace that phenomenon, or as Rabbi and others said, maybe you can identify a pattern, a conjectural pattern, something.
No, it's definitely something worth considering. The only thing that I suppose noticed in terms of what may have been post Seleucid usage of the coinage thus far, at least from my research, and something I noticed from museum notes, particularly with the British Museum, they have a number of coins that have been pierced, and the general speculation was that they might have been used for some sort of jewelry purpose, or for it's sort of like in that context, for not necessarily economic purposes, but then effectively resold in a more as effective as a cheaper alternative for jewelry, but obviously adhering to the value of the coin. But it's again,
I wouldn't be sure it's a cheaper alternative. I'd have to check, because that
well,
would be
that's
a
the thing.
practice well continued into the 18th century. You'd have
Exactly.
women bedecked with coins, and that would be their dowry, where they carry it along wherever they go.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because it's with all the notes, they never actually provide what would have been very helpful if we could know would be when that was actually done, because that would sort of, I suppose, give an idea of the lifespan of the coin in terms of circulation and practical use. Unfortunately, we don't get that, but I really, really wish we did, because that would make answering these questions a lot easier, more practical for me. But no, it's definitely something that I'll sort of be going away and having a look at in some more detail, because it's absolutely worth considering. But yeah, thank you again.
Okay, thank you. And then a last short intervention by 4D.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that that sort of clothing still exists as traditional clothing in the modern world. Even through the 20th century in Armenia, there's traditional Armenian clothes have like a whole necklace completely covered in coins, and as well as a diadem as well, so for women especially. So yeah, there's still it's still ongoing.
Excellent, some contemporary evidence to work with. Fantastic.
Good. Okay, I think our lecture has reached a natural end. We've exchanged many questions, and we have been stimulated by you, Elijah, to also think further about potentially defaced or damaged coins. And well, very much we look forward to your PhD to come to a conclusion and to be successfully defended, probably
Fingers
next
crossed.
year.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah. It's as Stephen reminds me, TikTok, the clock is slowly whittling away the hours. I'm convinced he's saying that to make me panic over the Christmas break, so I do more work. But I'm having at least one day off.
So we know, and you know what all of our New Year wishes are for you. And let me please thank you and Eva again for making this last lecture so delightful at the end of our 6th edition of the Seleukid Lecture Series. And before we go into the Christmas or winter break, let me announce that we are already about to set up the new lecture series starting on the 17th of January with a paper by our friend Kathy Lauber, who is also with us today, entitled Ptolemaic Influence on Seleucid Judah during through Tobiat Agency and Money. So something to look forward to as well. Let me end again by thanking everyone who has contributed to this lecture series throughout this year, especially my friend Rabbi Ben Scolnic, but all the other presenters and participants as well. May you have great holidays.